December 7th, 1941. 7:55 a.m. A Japanese torpedo rips through the hull of the USS Oklahoma, and 429 men are swallowed alive by black oil and cold harbor water before breakfast is finished. Then another torpedo, then another. Then a bomb finds the Arizona's forward magazine, and 1,177 men cease to exist in less than 9 seconds. The most powerful naval base in the Pacific is gone in under 2 hours. And every senior admiral in the United States Navy is suddenly very, very busy pretending they don't want the job of fixing it. 28 admirals. That's how many men Franklin Roosevelt skipped over to hand command of the shattered Pacific Fleet to a quiet Texan who once ran his first ship aground on a mudbank in the Philippines and got court-martialed for it. A man who spent 2 years signing personnel papers in a quiet Washington building, while other men got the famous commands and the newsreel cameras. A man so far removed from the celebrated halls of naval power that when his name first surfaced in Washington, the most feared admiral in the Navy looked at his staff and said one word: clerk. His name was Chester William Nimitz. He was 56 years old. He had 2 stars, and in 9 days, Franklin Roosevelt was going to give him 4, along with the responsibility for winning the most dangerous naval war in American history, with a fleet that was sitting on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. But to understand why that decision was the right one, and why it saved hundreds of thousands of lives and changed the course of human history, you have to understand what it felt like to stand on that dock on Christmas morning of 1941 and see clearly what no one else could see. You have to understand what was burning and what was not. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Chester Nimitz was eating breakfast with his wife Catherine in their quiet home in Washington, D.C. The radio was on in the next room. The first reports came in fragmented, half-believed, then unmistakable. He set down his coffee. He did not move for a long time. He was a rear admiral who ran a personnel office. He was not supposed to be the man the president called. He was not supposed to be anyone's answer to anything. He was the kind of officer who knew every man's file, who moved people around the chessboard of the Navy with quiet precision, who understood that the institution was made of human beings before it was made of ships. He was by every conventional measure the wrong man for the job that was about to be given to him. But conventional measures had just failed spectacularly at Pearl Harbor. The commander who stood at that harbor was Admiral Husband Edward Kimmel, 59 years old, meticulous, career Navy, respected and exhausted by his subordinates in equal measure. He watched his fleet die from the window of his office, while 353 Japanese aircraft came out of the clouds above Oahu on a Sunday morning when nobody was looking up. At one point, a spent .50 caliber bullet crashed through his office window and struck him in the chest. It bounced off, leaving a dark bruise on his white uniform. Kimmel picked it up, turned it over in his palm, said quietly that it would have been merciful if it had killed him. He understood what was happening, not just to the fleet, to him. 4 battleships on the harbor floor, a 5th beached and burning, 3 more crippled, 188 aircraft destroyed before they left the ground, 2,403 Americans dead. Kimmel was stripped of command 10 days later, reverted to 2 stars. His career was finished before his country had been at war for a fortnight. There would be 8 investigations. He would spend the rest of his life trying to clear his name. He never succeeded. Washington needed a name to blame, and Kimmel's name fit. But Washington had a more urgent problem than blame. Japan was advancing. Wake Island was under siege. Guam had fallen. The Philippines were collapsing. And the most important military command in America had no leader. Vice Admiral William Pye stepped in on a temporary basis. His first major decision defined him entirely. A relief force was already steaming toward Wake Island, where Marines had been holding the atoll alone for 2 weeks. Pye looked at the maps, looked at his remaining carriers, decided the risk was too great, and recalled the relief force 200 miles from the island. Wake fell to the Japanese on December 23rd. Pye was quietly removed from consideration for permanent command. His decision would haunt the Navy for the rest of the war. Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox had flown to Pearl Harbor himself. He walked through the wreckage. He stood in the burned hangars at Hickam Field with his shoes turning black with soot. He came back to the White House and told Roosevelt that the Pacific Fleet didn't just need a new commander. It needed a different kind of commander entirely. The list began with 28 names. 28 flag officers senior to the man Roosevelt would choose. Each was considered. Each was set aside. Not for cowardice. Not because they refused. Roosevelt never gave them the chance to refuse. He passed over each name because every senior admiral on that list had a fingerprint on the disaster. This one signed off on the pre-war Pacific deployment. That one served as Kimmel's deputy. Another had recommended concentrating the fleet at Pearl Harbor in the first place. Roosevelt was looking for a man without fingerprints. The man whose name kept surfacing was not what anyone expected. Chester Nimitz was born in Fredericksburg, Texas, a small hill country town so landlocked that the nearest ocean was a day's journey in any direction. His grandfather was a former German sea captain who had settled there and built a hotel shaped like a ship because he missed the ocean he would never see again. The boy grew up in a place that smelled of limestone and cedar, not salt water, and went to the Naval Academy because there was no money for any other school and the academy was free. He graduated in 1905. He ran a destroyer aground in 1908 in the harbor of Batangas in the Philippines. Court-martialed, found guilty of neglect of duty. Given the lightest possible punishment, a letter of reprimand, and allowed to stay in the Navy. The conviction never came off his record. 33 years later, when his name began to circulate as the possible new commander of the Pacific Fleet, it was still there, buried in the personnel files of the Bureau of Navigation, which Chester Nimitz himself now ran. The man being considered to save the United States Navy had once been convicted of wrecking his first ship. And here is the detail that history remembers least. In January of 1941, 11 months before Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt had quietly offered Chester Nimitz the command of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz turned it down. He told the president he was too junior, that the men senior to him would resent the promotion, that it would damage morale in the officer corps for years. He thanked the president. He went back to his desk and kept signing personnel papers. If he had said yes in January 1941, it would have been his fleet on the bottom of Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th. His name on the cables flooding into Washington. His career finished beside Kimmel's. Instead, by humility or chance or some quiet refusal, his hands were clean. His record was clear of the disaster. He was the man without fingerprints that Roosevelt was looking for. On December 16, 1941, 9 days after the attack, Nimitz was at his desk when a message arrived. The Secretary of the Navy wanted to see him immediately. He walked down the corridor in his blue uniform, quiet as he always was. Knox didn't ease into it. "The Pacific Fleet needs a new commander," Knox said. "The President has chosen you. The appointment is effective immediately." Nimitz said nothing for a moment. He was 56 years old. He had spent his entire career being passed over for the celebrated commands. He had turned down this exact job 11 months ago. Now there was no one else. He looked at Knox. He asked one question. He asked when he should leave. The president ordered him to travel in civilian clothes. He boarded the train at Union Station on December 19th, wearing a gray suit and a dark hat, carrying a small leather suitcase. His wife, Catherine, saw him off without tears. They had been married 30 years. She knew what this was. He arrived at Pearl Harbor at 7 in the morning on Christmas Day 1941. He stepped off a flying boat onto a dock still slick with fuel oil. The harbor in front of him was a graveyard. The masts of sunken battleships stuck out of the water at angles no naval architect ever drew. The hull of the Oklahoma, capsized, floated upside down like a dead whale. The Arizona was gone. The water was black with oil and gray with ash. But here is what Chester Nimitz saw that nobody else was seeing, because everyone else was counting the dead. The fuel tank farm sat 3/4 of a mile from Battleship Row. 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil. Enough to run the entire Pacific Fleet for a year and a half. The Japanese pilots had photographs of those tanks. They saw them. They did not bomb them. The submarine base stood untouched. 22 American submarines. None of them hit. The dry docks, the machine shops, the cranes, the repair yards, all intact. And every aircraft carrier in the Pacific Fleet, every single one, had been at sea on December 7th. The Japanese had sunk an old navy. They had not touched the new one. Standing alone on that dock in a civilian suit, while the harbor still burned around him, Chester Nimitz understood something that would take the rest of America months to learn. The disaster that had ended one navy had created the conditions for the navy that would win the war. He got into the car. He said nothing during the drive. He was already thinking about what came next, and what came next was going to shock Washington in ways nobody expected. Because the first decision he made when he took command was not to fire anyone. It was to keep everyone. And in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, in a smoke-filled room that smelled of cigarette ash and cold coffee, a man in a red velvet smoking jacket was sitting in carpet slippers working on a Japanese code that would change everything. In Part 1, we watched Chester Nimitz arrive at a burning harbor in a civilian suit on Christmas morning, take command of a shattered fleet from the deck of a submarine, and see something in the wreckage that nobody else could see. He kept the staff that Washington wanted fired. He walked into a smoke-filled basement and shook hands with a man in a red velvet smoking jacket who was cracking the Japanese naval code one intercepted message at a time. And he asked that man one question that would determine the outcome of the entire Pacific War. But here is what we did not tell you. The man in the basement had been working on a code that was cracked only 15% of the way through. 15%. The United States Navy was about to bet its last 3 carriers, its last hope of stopping Japan's advance across the Pacific, on 15% of a broken code, interpreted by one exhausted man that the admirals in Washington had already decided they did not trust. And the admirals in Washington were about to make their move. Admiral Ernest Joseph King was 63 years old and built like a courthouse. Tall, severe, permanently unimpressed. He had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet within days of Pearl Harbor, which meant he now sat above Nimitz in the chain of command and made no secret of his opinion of the man Roosevelt had chosen to save the Pacific. His staff said he shaved with a blowtorch. His subordinates said he was the most difficult man in the Navy to brief because he already believed he knew everything you were about to tell him. King had spent weeks studying Nimitz's record and reached a verdict he shared freely with anyone in his office. A desk admiral, a bureaucrat, a personnel clerk who had spent 2 years moving names around a roster board, while real naval officers commanded real ships in real seas. Commander Joseph John Rochefort did not help the situation. Rochefort ran Station Hypo, the combat intelligence unit, buried in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor. He was 41 years old, spoke Japanese, worked in carpet slippers, and a red velvet smoking jacket, had not seen sunlight in 3 weeks, and could quote from memory every Japanese radio call sign his unit had intercepted going back 5 years. He was also working on JN-25, the Imperial Japanese Navy's main operational code, a 5-digit superencipherment system that was one of the most secure communications architectures in the world. His team had cracked 15% of it, but 15% in the right hands was enough to see the shape of what was coming. In Washington, King had his own cryptanalysts, the Redman brothers, Commander John Redman and Captain Joseph Redman, both well-connected, both with the ear of Admiral King, both absolutely certain that Rochefort's analysis of Japanese intentions was wrong. Their reading of the intercepts pointed toward the American West Coast, possibly the Aleutian Islands, possibly Hawaii itself. The next Japanese offensive, the Redmans told King, was definitely not aimed at Midway Atoll, a speck of coral and runway in the Central Pacific that most people in Washington could not find on a map without help. Rochefort believed otherwise. He came up from the basement in early May of 1942 with a folder of intercepts and a conclusion that he laid in front of Nimitz without decoration or apology. The Japanese were planning a massive offensive against a target they called AF. Every signal pattern, every frequency shift, every coded reference in the last 6 weeks of intercepts pointed to a single location. AF was Midway. Yamamoto was coming with 4 fleet carriers, 7 battleships, and 248 aircraft. He believed the Americans had at most 2 carriers operational in the Pacific. He intended to destroy them and end the war in a single afternoon. Nimitz read the folder. He looked up at Rochefort. He asked how confident he was. Rochefort told him he would stake his career on it. Nimitz told him quietly that they were both already staking their careers on it. The problem was Washington. King's staff was actively lobbying against Rochefort's analysis. The Redmonds had the institutional weight, the political connections, and the direct line to the most powerful naval officer in America. Rochefort had carpet slippers and 15% of a broken code. The argument between Pearl Harbor and Washington over what the Japanese were about to do became the bitterest intelligence dispute of the entire war, and it was being fought in the background while Japan continued sweeping through the Southwest Pacific almost unopposed. So Rochefort set a trap. He sent a secure message by undersea cable to the garrison on Midway Island. The message contained simple instructions. Transmit in plain language on an open frequency that the freshwater distillation plant on the island has broken down. Do not explain why. Just transmit it. Then wait. 48 hours later, a Japanese intercept station in the Marshall Islands transmitted a coded message back to Tokyo. The message reported that AF was short of fresh water. Rochefort brought the decoded intercept upstairs. Nimitz read it once. He did not ask a second question. He gave the order. Every available carrier, every escort, every aircraft, every submarine that could steam was to position itself northeast of Midway in ambush. The Americans would be waiting for Yamamoto's fleet when it arrived. Washington was not convinced. King received Nimitz's operational plan and the intelligence analysis behind it and sent back a response that made clear he considered the whole enterprise a dangerous overcommitment based on unreliable intelligence. The Redmonds continued to insist the attack was aimed elsewhere. The argument went back and forth across 4,000 miles of telegraph wire while the calendar moved toward June and Yamamoto's fleet was already at sea. Nimitz did not argue. He prepared. There was one more problem. The man who was supposed to command the carrier task force at Midway was Vice Admiral William Halsey, the most aggressive carrier officer in the Navy, the man the crews loved and the Japanese feared. Halsey returned from the South Pacific on May 26th, covered in a dermatitis rash so severe the doctors believed it was shingles brought on by months of unbroken combat stress. The rash covered most of his body. He could barely stand. The doctors ordered him into bed for at minimum 1 month. From his hospital bed in considerable pain, Halsey asked Nimitz to come see him. When Nimitz arrived at his bedside, Halsey said one sentence, "Take Spruance." Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance was 55 years old, quiet, thin, intellectually cold, and had never commanded an aircraft carrier in his life. He commanded Halsey's cruiser screen. He was a surface warfare officer in every sense of the phrase. He was the precise opposite of Halsey in temperament, in style, in the way he occupied a room. He was also the man Halsey from a hospital bed covered in welts trusted with the most important naval engagement of the war. Nimitz agreed on the spot. The Yorktown complicated everything and solved everything in the same 72 hours. She had limped back to Pearl Harbor on May 27th from the Battle of the Coral Sea, trailing oil with a 250-kilogram bomb's worth of damage deep in her hull and fires on 4 decks that had been only partially controlled. The shipyard inspectors walked her damaged interior and came back to Nimitz with a report. 3 months minimum. 90 days at full effort. The Yorktown could not be made battle-ready in less time than that. Nimitz went down to the dry dock himself. He walked the same decks. He stood in the burned interior. He looked at the buckled steel. Then he turned to the chief of the shipyard and said 4 words. "We need her in 3 days." 1,400 men worked without stopping. Welders pulled off every other job in the yard. Floodlights rigged over the dry dock, so the work never paused for darkness. Men eating sandwiches at their stations. Men sleeping on deck plates for 2 hours and going back to work. They did, in 72 hours, what the inspectors said required 90 days. On May 30th, the Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor under her own power. She was heading to a battle that Washington still did not believe was going to happen. 3 carriers, 3 captains, 1 basement codebreaker whose analysis Washington had officially rejected, 1 admiral who had never commanded a carrier, 1 ship that should have been in dry dock for 3 months. This was the hand Nimitz was playing against 4 Japanese fleet carriers and the most experienced naval air force on Earth. On the night of June 3rd, the American carriers steamed in formation under a starless sky, 200 miles northeast of Midway. The crews had been told what was coming. They had been told the odds. In his cabin aboard the Enterprise, Raymond Spruance slept 4 hours and woke before dawn. He was not a carrier man. The man who was supposed to be in that cabin was in a hospital bed in Hawaii. The man who put him there was at Pearl Harbor 3,000 miles away, reading dispatches. At 5:34 in the morning on June 4, 1942, a PBY Catalina on patrol northwest of Midway broke radio silence. 2 words. Many planes. Minutes later, 2 carriers. Then a course. Yamamoto's fleet had been found exactly where Rochefort said it would be. What happened in the next 6 hours would permanently end the argument between Washington and Pearl Harbor about whose intelligence was right. It would also permanently end Japan's ability to win the Pacific War. But before the dive bombers found their targets, before the sky above the Japanese carriers filled with dauntlesses coming out of the sun, something else happened first that history does not often linger on. Something that cost the Navy almost everything, and something that in failing completely accidentally created the exact conditions that made victory possible. The torpedo bombers went in first, and not one of them came back, in the 2 parts. Before this one, Chester Nimitz arrived at a burning harbor, kept the staff. Washington wanted fired, walked into a basement, and shook the hand of a man in carpet slippers who was cracking the Japanese naval code 15% at a time, and then bet the last 3 carriers in the Pacific on that 15% being enough. He sent Raymond Spruance, a man who had never commanded a carrier in his life, to intercept the most powerful naval strike force Japan had ever assembled. And the last thing we heard was that the torpedo bombers went in first. Not one of them came back. 35 torpedo planes from 3 carriers, 41 aircrew. They flew straight into the teeth of the Japanese combat air patrol at wave height, slow and unescorted, and the Zeros killed them almost to the last man. Torpedo Squadron 8 lost all 15 aircraft. 29 of 30 men died in the water. 1 survived clinging to a seat cushion watching the rest of the battle from the Pacific Ocean. The other squadrons lost 10 of 14, 10 of 12. In less than an hour, the American torpedo attack was annihilated. Not a single torpedo found its target. The Japanese sailors on the carrier decks looked out at the burning wreckage in the water and understood they were winning. Again. But the Zeros were at sea level, chasing the last devastators across the water. The sky above them was completely empty. That is when the dive bombers arrived. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour. He was running low on fuel. He was close to the point of no return, the moment where he would have to turn for home or never make it back at all. Then he saw it. Far below him, a single Japanese destroyer running northeast at full speed, trailing a white wake across the blue water. McCluskey made a decision based on nothing but instinct. He guessed the destroyer was racing to rejoin the main fleet. He followed it. It led him directly to Yamamoto's carriers. McCluskey's dive bombers came out of the sun at 12,000 feet. At nearly the exact same moment by accident or by something that has no rational name. The dive bombers of Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie from the Yorktown arrived from the opposite direction. The Japanese carriers were caught simultaneously from 2 angles. Their flight decks were crowded with fueled aircraft. Ordnance was loose on the decks. Fuel hoses were uncoiled. The combat air patrol was at sea level dealing with the last of the torpedo bombers, and the sky above was open, and the Americans were already in their dives before anyone on the Japanese ships looked up. Between 10:22 and 10:31 on the morning of June 4, 1942, the war in the Pacific changed forever. 9 minutes. That is all it took. Lieutenant Richard Best put a 1,000-pound bomb through the flight deck of the Akagi Yamamoto's old flagship into the hangar deck below, where fueled and armed aircraft were waiting to launch. The Akagi erupted from the inside. She burned from stern to bow. Hundreds of her crew died in the first explosions. McCluskey's bombers covered the Kaga from end to end. 3 hits. 4 hits. She became a torch 1,000 feet long. Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown squadron hit the Soryu. 3 direct hits. She burned stem to stern. 3 Japanese fleet carriers. 3 of the 6 ships that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. All of them on fire. All of them dying in the same 9 minutes. Japan had trained those pilots for years. China, Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies. These were not replaceable men. The Japanese training pipeline was too slow, too rigid built for a war that was supposed to be short. It had no mechanism for replacing what it was losing in those 9 minutes above the Pacific. The 4th carrier, the Hiryu 20 miles north, was still untouched. She launched everything she had. At noon, Japanese dive bombers found the Yorktown. The same ship patched together in 72 hours. The ship that should not have been at Midway at all. 3 bombs into her. Stopped dead in the water. 2 hours later, torpedo bombers came in low. 2 torpedoes into her port side. She listed to 26 degrees. Abandoned ship. The Yorktown was dying for the 2nd time in a month. But the surviving American dive bombers found the Hiryu in the late afternoon. 4 bombs into her flight deck. She burned through the night. At dawn, her own crew set the scuttling charges, and she went to the bottom. 4 Japanese fleet carriers. Gone. The heavy cruiser Mikuma. 248 aircraft. More than 3,000 men. Irreplaceable veterans. Gone in a single day built on a 15% cracked code and a guess about a destroyer's wake. In his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, 3,000 miles from the battle, Nimitz read the dispatches as they came in. He did not celebrate. The Yorktown was still afloat on June 6th, drifting potentially salvageable. A skeleton crew reboarded her. On the afternoon of June 6th, a Japanese submarine got through the destroyer screen and put 2 torpedoes into her side. The destroyer Hammond lashed alongside to provide power for the salvage crew, broke in half from a 3rd torpedo and sank within minutes. The Yorktown rolled over and sank at dawn the next morning. The American price for Midway was 1 fleet carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. Against 4 Japanese carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and more than 3,000 men. But the numbers do not fully explain what happened. Japan lost at Midway what it could not manufacture again on any timeline the war would permit. The United States lost ships. Ships can be built. The men in the Midway air groups would be replaced by new pilots already in training. The Japanese aviators who died in those 9 minutes had no replacements waiting. From the morning of June 4, 1942, forward, the strategic initiative in the Pacific belonged permanently to the United States. In Washington, the admirals who had called Nimitz a desk admiral went quiet. Admiral King sent a single telegram. He congratulated the Pacific Fleet on a complete victory. He did not mention Joseph Rochefort. He did not mention the 15%. He did not mention the freshwater trap, or the intercept from the Marshall Islands, or the basement at Pearl Harbor that smelled of cigarette ash and cold coffee. 4 months later, in October of 1942, the men around King made their move. Rochefort was quietly relieved of command at Station Hypo. The Redmond brothers, the rival cryptanalysts in Washington, whose analysis had been entirely wrong, persuaded King that intelligence work should be centralized under their control. Rochefort outranked neither of them and had never learned to play the political game. He had no powerful friends in Washington. He had only been right about the most important military intelligence question of the entire Pacific War. He was reassigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco Bay. A floating dry dock. Nimitz protested in writing, twice. He was overruled both times. Rochefort accepted the reassignment without complaint. He commanded the dry dock for the rest of the war. He was recommended for the Distinguished Service Medal in 1942 and again in 1958. Both recommendations were buried somewhere in the basement of the Navy Department. He died in 1976 in a small house in Torrance, California, having received nothing for what he did in that basement at Pearl Harbor. The medal was finally given to his family 10 years after his death by President Ronald Reagan in 1986. This is what the Pacific War does to the men who win it. Nimitz went on commanding Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. He lost more carriers. He sent more men to die on more islands than any American commander in history. By the end of 1944, his Pacific Fleet was the largest naval force ever assembled by any nation in human history. 5,000 ships, 20,000 aircraft, 2 million men and women in uniform. Built from the wreckage of 8 battleships sitting on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. He never gave a speech that made the newsreels. He never posed for the cameras if he could avoid it. He wrote letters home to Catherine every week in the same quiet, careful handwriting he had used all his life. But here is the question that history almost never asks about Chester Nimitz. Not what he did, what he believed. In the years after the war, when interviewers came to ask him about Pearl Harbor, his answer was not what they expected. He did not call it a disaster. He did not call it a defeat. He said it was a mercy. He said that if Kimmel had known the Japanese were coming, he would have sailed out to meet them. The battleships would have been caught in open ocean, without air cover, against an enemy that had already demonstrated at Pearl Harbor and off the coast of Malaya what aircraft could do to a battleship in deep water. They would have been sunk in 2,000 fathoms. The crews would have drowned, tens of thousands of men, gone without a trace. Instead, at Pearl Harbor, the water was shallow. The men were rescued. 6 of the 8 battleships sunk on December 7th were eventually raised, repaired, and returned to service. Some of them were anchored in Tokyo Bay on the morning of the surrender. The disaster that ended one Navy created the conditions for the Navy that won the war. But there is one final chapter to this story. A chapter about what happened to the man himself after the war was over. About the costs he never spoke of. About the decision he made in the years that followed that tells you more about Chester Nimitz than any battle he ever fought. And about the strange, quiet ending of a man who saved the Pacific and then spent the rest of his life arguing that someone else deserved the credit. That chapter is the one almost no one knows. And it begins on the deck of the USS Missouri on the morning of September 2nd, 1945, with a pen in Chester Nimitz's hand and a Japanese delegation standing across a green felt table in formal dress. What happened after he signed that document is a story the newsreels never covered, and it may be the most important thing he ever did. On September 2nd, 1945, Chester Nimitz stepped forward on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, picked up a pen, and signed his name for the United States of America. The man who had taken command of the Pacific Fleet from the deck of a submarine because there were no battleships left was ending the war on the deck of a battleship because there was no enemy left. 4 years. 126 major operations. 2 million men and women under his command. The largest naval force in human history, built from the wreckage of 8 ships, sitting on the harbor floor at Pearl Harbor on a Sunday morning when nobody was looking up. But what happened to him after he set down that pen is the part of the story nobody tells, and it matters more than the battle. Nimitz came home to a country that wanted to put him on a pedestal and leave him there. He was promoted to Fleet Admiral, 5 stars, one of only 4 men in the entire history of the United States Navy to hold that rank. There were parades, there were speeches. Congress passed resolutions. His face appeared on the cover of every major magazine in America. He handled all of it with the same flat, quiet discomfort he had shown toward cameras his entire career. He gave the speeches because the country needed them. He accepted the honors because refusing them would have been its own kind of theater. Then he went home to California and tried to figure out what a man does after the Pacific War. What he did was argue for the men who had served under him and received nothing. He wrote letters, he made phone calls, He used every piece of institutional weight his 5 stars could carry to push for recognition of the people whose contributions had been buried, reassigned, or quietly erased by the political machinery of the Navy Department. He was not always successful. He was rarely thanked. He did it anyway in the same manner he had done everything, without announcement and without expectation of credit. Joseph Rochefort, the man in the carpet slippers who cracked the Japanese code and handed the United States the most decisive naval victory since Trafalgar, never received his Distinguished Service Medal while Nimitz was alive to fight for it. Nimitz recommended him twice. Twice the recommendation disappeared into the bureaucracy. Rochefort spent the rest of the war commanding a floating dry dock in San Francisco Bay, and retired quietly, and died in 1976 in a small house in Torrance, California, having told almost no one what he had done in that basement at Pearl Harbor. His medal was awarded by President Reagan in 1986, 10 years after his death, at a ceremony his daughter attended on his behalf. This is what the Pacific War did to the men who won it. It made some of them famous, and it made others invisible, and the line between those two outcomes had almost nothing to do with what they had actually contributed. Nimitz understood this. He said so directly in the years after the war. He said that the victory at Midway belonged to Rochefort before it belonged to Spruance, and to Spruance before it belonged to him. He said that the men who got the medals were rarely the men who made the decisions that mattered. He said this plainly, without bitterness, the way he said everything. He simply believed it was true, and he thought the record should reflect it. The record, as records do, reflected other things instead. The technology and doctrine that Nimitz built the new Pacific Fleet around carrier aviation, combined with submarine warfare and signals intelligence, did not stay in the Pacific after 1945. It became the architecture of American naval power for the next 8 decades. Every carrier strike group operating in the world today is a direct descendant of the operational concepts that Nimitz developed between December 1941 and September 1945. The idea that a fleet's most powerful striking arm flies above it rather than floats beside it. The idea that intelligence about the enemy's intentions is worth more than an extra battleship. The idea that submarines can strangle an industrial economy by cutting its supply lines across an ocean, all of these ideas existed before Nimitz. He did not invent them. What he did was trust them completely at the exact moment when trusting them required betting everything on the outcome. At Midway, the United States committed 3 carriers against 4. The numerical logic said Japan should win. The intelligence said otherwise. Nimitz chose to believe the intelligence. That choice, made in a quiet office at Pearl Harbor, based on a 15% cracked code and a freshwater deception, killed 4 Japanese fleet carriers and 3,000 irreplaceable aviators, and handed the United States the strategic initiative it never relinquished for the remaining 3 years of the war. Historians have estimated that the American victory at Midway shortened the Pacific War by somewhere between 1 and 2 years. 1 year of Pacific War, by any reasonable accounting, costs hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides across dozens of islands in the water between them and in the air above them. The arithmetic of what Nimitz's decisions saved is not a precise number. It is simply very large. The deeper lesson of this story is not about naval strategy. It is about what institutions do to the people who challenge their assumptions, and what it costs a nation when the wrong people are in charge at the wrong moment. 28 admirals were passed over to find Chester Nimitz. 28 men senior to him, more decorated than him, more celebrated than him, each of them carrying a fingerprint on the disaster that Roosevelt needed a man without fingerprints to fix. The Navy's own hierarchy, left to its own preferences, would never have chosen him. It required a president with enough independence from institutional thinking to look past rank and seniority and ask a different question. Not who has the most impressive record, who sees the situation most clearly. Nimitz saw clearly. He saw it on Christmas morning on a dock in a civilian suit while the harbor still burned around him. He saw that the Japanese had sunk an old navy and left a new one untouched. He saw that the fuel and the submarines and the dry docks and the carriers were all intact. He saw that the disaster had cleared the board of the weapons that would have lost the war and left standing the weapons that would win it. Nobody else saw this on December 25, 1941. They were all counting the dead. The ability to see what remains when everything visible has been destroyed is not a skill that appears on any Navy fitness report. It is not something you learn at the Naval Academy, or in a destroyer command, or in a bureau in Washington. It is something rarer and harder to name, and it is the reason that a rear admiral, who once ran his first ship aground on a mud bank in the Philippines, was the right man to save the United States Navy from the worst defeat in its history. Here is the detail that most accounts of this story leave out. The court-martial, the mud bank in Batangas Harbor in July of 1908. The 23-year-old ensign who ran the USS Decatur aground and was found guilty of neglect of duty and given a letter of reprimand and allowed to stay in the Navy. That conviction sat in his personnel file for 33 years. It was still there in December of 1941, buried in the Bureau of Navigation, which Chester Nimitz himself now ran. He had access to his own file. He knew it was there. He had lived with it for 3 decades. When Roosevelt chose him to command the Pacific Fleet, Nimitz said nothing about it. He did not ask to have it expunged or minimized or quietly removed. He did not mention it to Knox when Knox told him he was being appointed. He simply accepted the command and got on the train in a gray suit and went to do the job. The record stayed in the file exactly as it had always been the record of a young officer who made a mistake and accepted the consequences and kept going. There is something in that detail that explains the whole man. He did not need the record to be clean. He needed the work to be done. The distinction between those two things is not obvious to everyone. It was obvious to him from the moment he ran that destroyer aground in 1908 and had to stand in front of a court-martial and answer for it. He had made a mistake. He had been held accountable. He had learned something. He had moved on. 33 years later, he was signing the surrender documents for the most powerful military empire in Asian history. The mud bank in Batangas was still in the file. From a personnel clerk with a court-martial on his record and 2 stars on his collar, to fleet admiral of the greatest naval force in human history. Chester Nimitz traveled a distance that no conventional measure of military merit would have predicted. He did it by seeing clearly when others were counting wreckage, by trusting the people around him when Washington wanted them fired, by believing a man in carpet slippers in a smoke-filled basement when the admirals in suits said not to, and by understanding that the disaster that had destroyed one navy had created the exact conditions for building a better one. More than 300,000 Americans served in the Pacific Fleet under his command. The Japanese Empire that launched 353 aircraft against Pearl Harbor on a Sunday morning surrendered formally and completely, less than 4 years later, on the deck of a ship anchored in the bay it had been trying to protect. If you have spent the last 90 minutes with this story, you already know why it matters. But share it if you think someone else should hear it, because the lesson here is not only about the Pacific War. It is about every institution that passes over the right person, because the right person does not look like what the institution expects. It is about every idea dismissed as insane before it was proven necessary. It is about every man in a basement in carpet slippers who turns out to be the one who changes everything. The Navy gave Roosevelt his medal in 1986, 10 years too late. That is how long it takes sometimes for the record to catch up with the truth. Chester Nimitz knew this. He accepted it. He signed his letters to Catherine in the same handwriting he had always used, and he kept making the case for the men who had been overlooked. And he never once suggested that the mud bank in Batangas should be removed from his file, because the mud bank was part of the story too.